The morning sun cast long shadows across Millfield's quiet streets as Maya Rodriguez finished her early jog through the suburban neighborhood. She paused at the corner of Oak and Main, catching her breath while checking her fitness tracker. As a paramedic for the local emergency services, Maya had learned to appreciate these peaceful moments before her shift began. The town of 30,000 felt especially serene today, with only the distant sound of lawnmowers and the occasional car passing by. She had no idea that this would be the last normal morning any of them would experience. Across town, Jessica Thompson was already 3 hours into her shift at Millfield General Hospital. As the head nurse in the emergency department, she prided herself on maintaining order even during the busiest nights. But today felt different somehow. There had been an unusual number of patients arriving with what appeared to be severe flu symptoms, accompanied by aggressive behavior that seemed completely out of character for the typically mild-mannered residents of their community. The latest patient, an elderly man named Walter, had actually tried to bite Dr. Patterson during examination. Security had been called twice already, and it wasn't even noon yet. Meanwhile, Ashley Miller was conducting her weekly inventory at Miller's hardware store, the family business her grandfather had established 60 years ago. She moved efficiently through the aisles, checking stock levels of everything from garden tools to emergency supplies. Ashley had inherited not just the store but also her grandfather's practical wisdom about being prepared for anything. The basement stockroom contained enough camping gear, tools, and basic supplies to outfit a small expedition. Her military training from her 4 years in the National Guard had taught her the value of preparation, though she never imagined she'd need those skills in sleepy Millfield. At the elementary school on the other side of town, Rachel Kim was helping her 4th-grade students with their science project about plant growth. As one of the youngest teachers in the district, she brought enthusiasm and creativity to her classroom that made learning fun. The children were excitedly measuring their bean sprouts when the principal's voice crackled over the intercom, asking all teachers to report to the main office immediately after dismissal. There was something in Mrs. Henderson's tone that made Rachel's stomach tighten with unease, though she maintained her cheerful demeanor for the children. Diana Walsh sat in her patrol car, reviewing incident reports from the previous evening. As one of only 3 female officers in the Millfield Police Department, she had worked twice as hard to prove herself worthy of respect. The reports painted a troubling picture of increasing violence and erratic behavior throughout the county. 3 separate domestic disturbance calls, 2 reports of aggressive animals, and a bizarre incident at the county hospital where a patient had somehow escaped from the morgue before being found wandering the parking lot in a disoriented state. The pieces didn't quite fit together, but Diana's instincts told her something significant was brewing. None of these 5 women knew each other personally, despite living in the same small community. Maya had treated patients brought in by Diana's patrol unit. Jessica had worked alongside the doctors who treated Maya's emergency calls. Ashley had sold camping supplies to Rachel for her classroom outdoor education program. Diana had written reports about incidents involving patients who would later end up in Jessica's emergency department. Their lives intersected in the invisible web that connected all small-town residents, yet they remained strangers to one another. The first real sign of trouble came at exactly 2:47 p.m. when the emergency broadcast system interrupted regular programming on every television and radio in town. The message was brief and unsettling. Residents were advised to remain indoors and avoid contact with anyone displaying signs of illness or aggressive behavior. Local authorities were investigating reports of a contagious outbreak that appeared to affect the nervous system and cognitive function. Medical facilities were operating under emergency protocols, and the National Guard had been contacted as a precautionary measure. Maya was restocking her ambulance when the broadcast echoed through the fire station. Jessica heard it over the hospital's intercom system as she tried to manage an increasingly chaotic emergency department. Ashley listened from behind the counter of her store as the few afternoon customers exchanged worried glances. Rachel gathered her students for early dismissal while trying to process what the announcement might mean. Diana received the official briefing over her radio while parked outside the town's medical center, watching as more emergency vehicles arrived every few minutes. As the afternoon wore on, each woman would make decisions that seemed small at the time but would prove crucial in the dark days ahead. None of them could have predicted that by sunset, their quiet town would become ground zero for something that would test every ounce of courage, intelligence, and determination they possessed. The calm was ending, and the storm was about to begin. The first scream pierced the afternoon quiet at 4:23 p.m., echoing from the direction of Millfield Elementary just as parents began arriving for pickup. Rachel Kim was erasing the whiteboard when she heard it, followed immediately by shouting and the sound of car doors slamming. She rushed to her classroom window and saw chaos unfolding in the parking lot below. Mrs. Henderson, the principal, was backing away from someone who moved with an unnaturally jerky, aggressive gait. Even from the second floor, Rachel could see that something was terribly wrong with the figure pursuing her boss. The person's clothes were torn and stained dark, and their movements seemed wrong somehow, like a marionette with tangled strings. Maya Rodriguez was responding to her third emergency call of the hour when her radio crackled with reports of multiple incidents across town. She and her partner Jake were racing toward a reported attack at the senior living facility when they passed a car accident on Elm Street. What they saw made Maya's blood run cold. A woman was standing beside an overturned sedan, but instead of helping the trapped driver, she was clawing at the window with her bare hands, leaving bloody streaks on the glass. Her face was turned away, but Maya could see bite marks covering her exposed arms. When the woman finally looked up at the passing ambulance, Maya gasped. The woman's eyes were completely clouded over, milky white like cataracts, and dark fluid was streaming from her mouth. At Millfield General, Jessica Thompson found herself in the middle of a nightmare that defied all her medical training. The emergency department had filled beyond capacity with patients displaying symptoms that made no medical sense. They arrived with severe bite wounds, high fevers, and complete loss of cognitive function, but within hours, something far worse happened. The elderly man who had tried to bite Dr. Patterson earlier had died from his injuries, but 20 minutes later, he had somehow gotten up from his bed and attacked a nurse in the adjoining room. Jessica had personally checked his pulse and confirmed his death, yet security cameras showed him moving through the corridors with that same jerky, predatory gait. 3 more patients had undergone the same impossible transformation, and now Jessica was barricading herself in the supply closet with 2 other nurses, listening to inhuman groaning echoing through the hallways. Diana Walsh received the officer in distress call while investigating reports of vandalism at the shopping center. She arrived at Maple Street to find Officer Bradley's patrol car empty, its driver's side door hanging open and the radio still crackling with his last transmission. Following a trail of disturbed ground and what looked like drag marks, she found Bradley behind the hardware store, but he was no longer the colleague she had known for 3 years. His uniform was shredded, revealing deep gashes across his torso, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. When he turned toward her, Diana saw that his eyes held no recognition, no humanity whatsoever. She called his name, hoping against hope, but Bradley only responded with a low, guttural moan before lunging at her with surprising speed. Ashley Miller had been watching the street from her store window when she witnessed the attack on Officer Bradley. Her military instincts kicked in immediately as she recognized the tactical situation developing outside. She quickly moved to secure the store, locking the front entrance and activating the metal security shutters her grandfather had installed during the civil rights era. The basement stockroom became her staging area as she gathered supplies and weapons, including the hunting rifles and ammunition she kept for the local sportsmen. Through the small basement window, she could see more figures moving through the streets with that same disturbing gait, and she noticed they seemed drawn to sound and movement. Ashley's strategic mind began processing the threat assessment: fast-moving, aggressive attackers who showed no fear or pain response, possibly attracted to noise, and apparently impervious to normal injury. As evening approached, the 5 women found themselves fighting for survival in a world that had transformed in mere hours. Rachel barricaded herself in her classroom with 6 students whose parents hadn't arrived, using desks and chairs to block the door while strange sounds echoed through the school building. Maya and Jake had abandoned their ambulance after being surrounded by a group of the infected, taking refuge in an abandoned gas station where they tried desperately to radio for backup that never came. Jessica led a small group of survivors through the hospital's service tunnels, avoiding the creatures that now roamed the corridors above. Diana had fought her way back to her patrol car after shooting the thing that had once been Bradley, her hands shaking as she realized that headshots seemed to be the only effective way to stop them. Ashley remained in her fortified hardware store, monitoring emergency radio frequencies and watching through security cameras as her quiet hometown descended into chaos. None of them yet understood the full scope of what they were facing, but each had learned the same terrible truth: the dead were walking, and the living were running out of places to hide. The emergency radio frequency crackled with desperate voices as darkness fell over Millfield. Ashley Miller adjusted the antenna on her grandfather's old CB radio, trying to filter through the chaos of panicked transmissions. Most were fragmented distress calls or government warnings that repeated the same useless advice to stay indoors and avoid contact with the infected. But then she heard something different, a calm, professional voice cutting through the static. It was Diana Walsh, attempting to coordinate with any surviving law enforcement and emergency personnel. Ashley grabbed the microphone, her military training guiding her radio protocol as she identified herself and her location at Miller's hardware store on Main Street. Diana was barricaded inside the police station when Ashley's transmission came through. The station had become a tomb for most of her colleagues, but the building's reinforced structure and security systems had kept her alive through the night. She had been trying to establish contact with anyone who might have tactical knowledge or resources when the hardware store owner responded. Through their brief exchange, Diana learned that Ashley had military experience and access to weapons and supplies. More importantly, Ashley's store sat at a strategic intersection that offered multiple escape routes and clear sight lines in all directions. Meanwhile, Maya Rodriguez and her partner Jake had spent the night moving from building to building, trying to reach other survivors. They had picked up fragments of Diana and Ashley's radio conversation on their emergency scanner, and Maya recognized the tactical advantage of linking up with them. Her medical training had already proven crucial. Jake had been bitten during their escape from the gas station, but Maya's quick thinking and field treatment had prevented infection by immediately cauterizing the wound with a heated knife blade. She wasn't certain this would work long-term, but so far Jake remained lucid and uninfected. They began making their way toward Main Street, using Maya's knowledge of the town's layout to avoid the main roads where groups of infected seemed to gather. At Millfield General Hospital, Jessica Thompson had managed something that seemed impossible under the circumstances. She had successfully led 12 survivors through the hospital's maze of service tunnels and maintenance areas, emerging in the medical supply warehouse 3 blocks from the main building. Among her group were 2 other nurses, Dr. Patricia Reeves from Pediatrics, a security guard named Marcus, and 7 patients who had been lucid enough to follow evacuation procedures. Jessica's leadership during the crisis had been instinctive. Her years of managing emergency situations translated perfectly to organizing people under extreme stress. She had been monitoring emergency frequencies on a portable radio salvaged from an ambulance, and when she heard the coordination efforts between Diana and Ashley, she knew they represented the best hope for long-term survival. Rachel Kim faced the most heartbreaking decision of the crisis. 3 of the 6 children in her care had been claimed by parents who managed to reach the school before the situation became completely untenable. But young Tommy Martinez, 8-year-old Emma Foster, and 6-year-old Lucas Wright remained with her as their family's fate remained unknown. Rachel had kept them calm through the night by turning their survival into a game of hide-and-seek, but she knew they couldn't remain in the classroom much longer. The infected had breached the main building, and their groaning echoed through the hallways with increasing frequency. When she heard Jessica's group calling for any survivors to make contact, Rachel realized she had to risk everything to get the children to safety. The convergence began at dawn when Jessica's medical team established communication protocols with Diana's tactical position. Using Ashley's store as a rally point made strategic sense. It offered defensible positions, supply access, and radio communications. Maya and Jake arrived first, their paramedic vehicle allowing them to navigate the infected-filled streets more safely than those traveling on foot. Maya's medical expertise immediately proved invaluable when she helped Dr. Reeves treat two injured members of Jessica's group who had sustained wounds during their escape from the hospital. Diana coordinated the rescue of Rachel and the children using tactical precision that impressed even Ashley's military sensibilities. They created a distraction at the school's main entrance while Rachel led the children through a basement window that connected to the old storm drain system. Ashley provided covering fire from strategic positions while Diana guided them through the safest route to the hardware store. The reunion was emotional but brief. They all understood that survival required immediate action and long-term planning. As the sun rose over what remained of Millfield, the 5 women found themselves responsible for 15 survivors total. They had unconsciously formed a leadership council based on their complementary skills: Diana's tactical knowledge, Jessica's medical expertise and organizational abilities, Maya's emergency response training, Ashley's military background and resource management, and Rachel's natural ability to maintain morale and care for the most vulnerable members of their group. They didn't yet know if other pockets of survivors existed, or whether help would come from outside their devastated town, but they had each other. For the first time since the nightmare began, hope seemed like more than just a distant memory. The transformation of Miller's hardware store into a fortress began with Ashley's methodical assessment of their defensive capabilities and resource inventory. She moved through the building with Diana at her side, pointing out structural advantages while mentally cataloging weapons, tools, and supplies that could mean the difference between survival and death. The store's thick brick walls dated back to the 1940s, built to withstand both time and weather, and now they would serve as protection against a far more sinister threat. Ashley showed Diana how the basement connected to a network of old utility tunnels that could serve as escape routes, while the second floor offered excellent sightlines and defensive positions. Together, they developed a comprehensive security plan that utilized every window, door, and potential breach point. Diana's law enforcement training complemented Ashley's military experience perfectly as they established patrol schedules, designated shooting positions, and created early warning systems using the store's existing security cameras and motion sensors. Jessica Thompson took charge of organizing the human element of their survival operation, transforming the store's break room into a medical station and establishing protocols that would keep 15 people alive and healthy in confined quarters. She worked closely with Dr. Reeves to inventory their medical supplies, which included not just the basic first aid materials Ashley had in stock, but also prescription medications and surgical supplies they had managed to salvage from the hospital. Jessica's organizational skills proved invaluable as she created duty rosters, established hygiene protocols to prevent disease, and set up sleeping arrangements that maximized both comfort and security. She also recognized the psychological challenges they faced and worked with Rachel to maintain group morale through structured activities and clear communication about their situation. Her natural leadership abilities emerged as she mediated disputes, made difficult resource allocation decisions, and ensured that every member of their group felt valued and heard. Maya Rodriguez established their medical and emergency response capabilities, using her paramedic training to create a triage system for treating injuries while also developing protocols for dealing with potential infections within their group. She worked tirelessly to understand the nature of the outbreak, studying the behavior patterns of the infected they could observe from their fortified position and documenting everything she learned about transmission methods, incubation periods, and survival rates. Maya's observations revealed crucial information. The infected were drawn to sound and movement but seemed to have limited memory and problem-solving abilities. They were most active during certain hours, and they appeared to decompose more rapidly than normal corpses, suggesting their rampage might be self-limiting if survivors could outlast the initial wave. Her medical expertise also proved essential when Jake's bite wound showed signs of infection despite her field treatment, requiring round-the-clock monitoring and experimental antibiotic therapy using veterinary supplies from the store's pet section. Rachel Kim became their morale officer and civilian coordinator, taking special responsibility for the children while also helping the adult survivors cope with the psychological trauma of losing everything they had known. She established educational activities for Tommy, Emma, and Lucas that doubled as useful survival training, teaching them basic first aid, radio operation, and quiet movement techniques disguised as games and learning exercises. Rachel's classroom management skills translated perfectly to managing a diverse group of adults under extreme stress, and she developed conflict resolution techniques that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into dangerous confrontations. She also maintained their connection to the outside world by monitoring news broadcasts and emergency transmissions, documenting reports of other survivor groups and government response efforts that painted a grim picture of nationwide collapse. As the days passed, their makeshift fortress began to feel like a genuine home rather than just a survival shelter. Ashley's practical improvements included solar panels rigged to car batteries for reliable power, a rainwater collection system, and clever modifications to the building's ventilation that would mask their presence from passing infected while keeping the air fresh. Diana established contact with 2 other survivor groups in neighboring counties, creating a loose network of communication that provided both tactical intelligence and psychological comfort. Jessica's medical protocols had successfully prevented any disease outbreaks within their group, while her leadership had helped them develop sustainable routines for everything from cooking to waste disposal. Maya's ongoing research into the infection had yielded enough information for them to venture outside during certain low-activity periods for supply runs and reconnaissance. Rachel's educational programs had not only kept the children stable and engaged but had also helped the adults develop new skills essential for their changed world. By the end of their second week in the hardware store fortress, the 15 survivors had evolved from a desperate collection of refugees into a cohesive community with clear leadership, defined roles, and genuine hope for long-term survival. They had established radio contact with military units operating 3 counties away, learned that several major cities were implementing successful quarantine zones, and discovered that the infection appeared to be burning itself out in areas where survivors could maintain isolation for extended periods. But their growing confidence would soon be tested by challenges that would require every ounce of courage, skill, and unity they had built together. The crisis began with a single mistake that would haunt Jessica Thompson for the rest of her life. It was their 18th day in the fortress when 7-year-old Emma Foster developed a high fever that spiked dangerously during the night, and Jessica made the decision to use the store's backup generator to power medical equipment for an emergency procedure. Dr. Reeves needed electricity to operate the portable ultrasound machine they had salvaged, suspecting internal bleeding from a fall Emma had taken during their latest supply run. The generator's rumbling echoed through the night air for nearly 3 hours while they worked to save the little girl's life, and Jessica was so focused on the medical emergency that she ignored Maya's growing concerns about the noise. By dawn, they could see the results of their life-saving efforts. A massive horde of infected, easily 300 strong, had been drawn by the sound and now surrounded their fortress completely. Ashley's security cameras revealed the horrifying scope of their situation as infected bodies pressed against every exit, their groaning creating a constant, maddening chorus that penetrated even the building's thick walls. Diana immediately implemented lockdown protocols, but they all knew their supplies wouldn't last more than a week under siege conditions, and the infected showed no signs of losing interest or moving on. Maya's observations revealed that this horde behaved differently from the smaller groups they had encountered. They seemed more organized, more persistent, and some appeared to retain enough cognitive function to attempt coordinated attacks on weak points in their defenses. Ashley's military training told her what none of them wanted to hear: their fortress had become their tomb unless they could find a way to break through the horde or escape through routes that might already be compromised. The psychological pressure intensified when Jake's conditions suddenly deteriorated, his old bite wound reopening despite weeks of successful treatment, and Maya realized with growing horror that the infection might have a delayed activation trigger they hadn't understood. Jessica found herself torn between maintaining hope for the group and confronting the possibility that they might have to make impossible choices about who could be saved. Rachel struggled to keep the children calm while hiding her own terror, but even Tommy and Lucas could sense that something had fundamentally changed in their safe haven. Dr. Reeves worked frantically to develop theories about the infection's progression, but her research was interrupted by increasingly aggressive attempts by the infected to breach their defenses, including coordinated attacks on the building's structural weak points that suggested a level of intelligence that terrified even Diana's tactical mind. The breaking point came on their 21st day when the infected began exhibiting new behaviors that defied everything they thought they knew about the outbreak. Some were using tools, Others were communicating through complex vocalizations, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to be learning from their failed attempts to enter the building. Ashley discovered that several infected had managed to access the utility tunnels she had counted on as escape routes, effectively trapping them in the upper floors with diminishing supplies and no clear exit strategy. The group faced their first serious internal conflict when Marcus the security guard suggested they should abandon Jake and Emma, arguing that the sick were slowing them down and attracting more infected, while Rachel absolutely refused to consider leaving any of the children behind regardless of the circumstances. Diana found herself mediating between increasingly desperate factions within their group, those who wanted to attempt a fighting retreat to reach the rumored government safe zones, others who believed they should remain fortified and wait for military rescue, and a growing number who were beginning to lose hope entirely. Maya's medical expertise became crucial when she discovered that Jake's infection was actually responding to an experimental treatment, giving them hope that the disease might be treatable, but she also realized that Emma's injury was more serious than they had initially believed and required surgical intervention they couldn't provide in their current situation. Jessica's leadership was tested as never before when she had to choose between maintaining group unity and making the hard decisions necessary for survival, particularly when it became clear that their radio communications had been compromised and the military units they had been counting on for rescue had gone silent 3 days earlier. The fortress that had represented safety and hope for 3 weeks was now a trap that threatened to become their grave, and each of the 5 women faced the realization that their next decisions would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of every person who had trusted them with their lives. As infected bodies continued to press against their defenses and supplies dwindled to critical levels, they knew that staying meant certain death, but leaving meant venturing into a world that had become far more dangerous than any of them had imagined, with enemies that were evolving faster than their ability to understand or counter them. The escape plan that would either save them all or doom them to a horrific death came together in desperate whispers during their darkest hour, when Ashley discovered through the security cameras that the infected horde had begun systematically dismantling their defenses with a coordination that spoke of terrifying intelligence. Diana's tactical assessment revealed their only chance lay in a precision operation that would require split-second timing, absolute courage, and the kind of teamwork that could only emerge from weeks of shared survival under impossible circumstances. They would create a massive distraction using the store's entire inventory of fireworks and propane tanks, coordinated with Ashley's remaining explosive materials, while simultaneously executing a fighting withdrawal through the compromised tunnel system that Maya had discovered connected to the old subway maintenance routes beneath downtown Millfield. Jessica took on the most dangerous role, volunteering to remain behind with Dr. Reeves to manually trigger the explosions that would scatter the horde, buying precious minutes for the others to escape with the children and the wounded Jake, whose condition had stabilized enough for transport but who remained critically vulnerable. Rachel accepted the responsibility of leading Tommy, Emma, and Lucas through the tunnel system, using her natural ability to keep them calm while Diana and Ashley provided tactical cover, but the plan required absolute silence and precision that left no room for error or hesitation. The execution began at dawn when Maya created the initial distraction by using the store's PA system to broadcast emergency signals that drew the infected toward the building's eastern wall, while Ashley simultaneously detonated shaped charges she had constructed from hardware store materials to create a controlled breach in the western foundation wall. Diana led the first wave through the tunnels, her law enforcement training guiding them through the maze of maintenance passages while Ashley provided rearguard security, both women moving with deadly efficiency as they encountered infected who had already penetrated the underground routes. Rachel's group followed closely behind, the children displaying remarkable courage as they navigated the dark, cramped spaces while Emma fought through her pain and Tommy and Lucas helped support Jake when Maya couldn't manage his weight alone. The tunnels proved to be both salvation and nightmare as they discovered that the infected had not only found these routes but had been using them as highways to spread throughout the city's underground infrastructure, creating a three-dimensional battlefield where threats could emerge from any direction without warning. Jessica's explosion sequence bought them the time they needed, but it also triggered a massive collapse that trapped her and Dr. Reeves in the upper levels of the building while simultaneously bringing down sections of the tunnel system that forced Diana to make split-second route changes through areas none of them had mapped or explored. Maya's medical training became crucial when Jake suffered a seizure in the narrow confines of a maintenance shaft, requiring her to perform emergency treatment in total darkness while infected groans echoed from multiple directions and the structural integrity of their escape route continued to deteriorate around them. Ashley's military experience proved invaluable when they encountered a large group of the evolved infected who had learned to coordinate ambush tactics, forcing her to use improvised explosives and tactical movement to clear a path while protecting the civilians under increasingly desperate circumstances. Rachel's leadership kept the children functional when they emerged from the tunnels into the abandoned subway station to discover that the infection had spread far beyond their worst estimates, with evidence of massive battles between military forces and infected hordes that had left the underground facility littered with bodies and abandoned equipment. Diana's tactical knowledge guided them through the subway system toward their ultimate destination, the emergency broadcast center 3 miles away where government signals indicated a possible evacuation point, but the journey required traveling through the heart of the infected zone where the creatures had established what could only be described as primitive settlements. The revelation that the infected were not just mindlessly aggressive but were developing social structures and territorial behaviors forced all 5 women to reconsider everything they thought they knew about survival and adaptation in their new world. As they emerged from the underground darkness into a city that had been transformed into something from humanity's worst nightmares, each woman drew upon reserves of courage and determination they never knew they possessed, knowing that their next few hours would determine whether their journey from ordinary citizens to hardened survivors would end in triumph or tragedy. The heart of darkness lay ahead, but they faced it together, their bonds forged in crisis stronger than the fear that threatened to overwhelm them. The emergency broadcast center stood like a beacon of hope amid the devastation, its reinforced concrete structure and communication arrays intact despite the chaos that had consumed the rest of downtown Millfield. But as Diana led their exhausted group through the final blocks of infected territory, they discovered that hope often comes with a price that tests every principle they had fought to maintain. The center was indeed operational, staffed by a joint military and civilian team that had been coordinating rescue operations across 3 states. But their commander, Colonel Harrison, presented them with an ultimatum that challenged everything they had learned about survival and sacrifice. The evacuation helicopters had limited capacity and weight restrictions, and Jake's deteriorating condition made him a medical liability that could compromise the entire rescue operation. Maya's fierce advocacy for her patient clashed with military protocol, while Jessica's leadership experience, gained through her harrowing escape from the hardware store explosion that had cost Dr. Reeves her life, demanded they find a solution that honored both tactical necessity and human compassion. Ashley's military background gave her unique insight into the colonel's perspective, but her weeks of fighting alongside these people had transformed her understanding of what truly mattered in survival situations, leading her to propose a compromise that would utilize her demolitions expertise to create a defensible position where Jake could receive proper medical treatment while waiting for the next evacuation wave. Rachel's unwavering commitment to protecting Tommy, Emma, and Lucas had earned her the respect of the military personnel, who recognized in her the kind of leadership that emerged naturally from crisis rather than being imposed by rank or protocol, and her advocacy for keeping their group together ultimately swayed the colonel's decision. Diana's law enforcement experience proved crucial in negotiating the complex logistics of their evacuation, as she coordinated with military units to ensure that other survivor groups they had contacted during their journey would also be prioritized for rescue operations that were expanding rapidly as government forces regained control of strategic areas. The revelation that Jessica had survived the hardware store explosion by taking shelter in the building's reinforced basement came through a crackling radio transmission that brought tears of relief to their exhausted group, and her report that the massive detonation had successfully scattered the infected horde validated their desperate gamble while providing tactical intelligence that helped military forces develop more effective clearing operations. Maya's experimental treatment protocols, documented throughout their ordeal, became the foundation for medical research that would eventually lead to both preventive measures and treatment options for the infection, transforming her from a small-town paramedic into a crucial contributor to humanity's recovery efforts. Ashley's detailed observations about infected behavior patterns and evolution provided military strategists with intelligence that revolutionized their approach to containment and elimination operations, while her leadership during their escape had demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that earned her a commission offer from Colonel Harrison himself. Rachel's educational background and natural ability to maintain group cohesion under extreme stress made her invaluable to the civilian coordination efforts that were crucial for managing the massive refugee populations created by the outbreak, and her success in keeping the children psychologically stable provided models for trauma treatment that would help thousands of young survivors. Diana's law enforcement experience and proven ability to coordinate multiple groups under crisis conditions led to her appointment as a liaison between military forces and civilian survivor communities, a role that would prove essential as society began the long process of rebuilding. As their helicopter lifted off from the emergency broadcast center, carrying them toward a secure zone where medical treatment, hot meals, and actual beds awaited, each of the 5 women reflected on how profoundly they had been changed by their shared ordeal, understanding that they had discovered strengths and capabilities they never knew they possessed. The children who had trusted them with their lives were safe, Jake's condition had stabilized enough for transport to advanced medical facilities, and Jessica's survival meant that their leadership team remained intact for whatever challenges lay ahead in a world that would never again be the same. 6 months later, as Maya worked in a research facility developing better treatment protocols, Ashley trained new military units in anti-infected tactics, Jessica managed medical operations at a major survivor settlement, Diana coordinated security for expanding safe zones, and Rachel established educational programs for displaced children. They maintained the bonds forged in crisis through regular communication and occasional reunions that reminded them of their shared triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The zombie outbreak had taken everything they had known and loved, but it had also revealed the extraordinary courage that ordinary people could find when faced with extraordinary circumstances, proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, hope could survive and flourish when people chose to stand together rather than fall alone.